Live.
Good evening. Welcome to the Trouble at Home, the Mark Twain House and Museum's bi-weekly conversation with various Twainian people of all stripes. This is the continuation of our 10-year-old program, The Trouble Begins at 5:30, which has been very, very popular through the years. As you know, probably the Mark Twain House is now open for limited visitation by reservation. You can go to our site, marktwainhouse.org, and learn all about how you can do that. And if you are farther away or not inclined to do that, we of course have an expanded virtual tour online on that same site, and you can follow the fairly easy signposts to that virtual tour and see the house for yourself with all sorts of added descriptions and storytelling and so on. But tonight we are lucky to have Dr. Pat Ober of Wake Forest School of Medicine in North Carolina. But let me add one thing before we get on to Pat, that you may see that there are a few little lines of text along the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask a question, don't do it in the chat area. Go down to right next to where it says people, and there's a bunch of what look like little, old video machine characters. It says people 129, it says ask a question. So if you want to ask a question as it comes up during our talk, just go there, and Jennifer LaRue, who is our behind the scenes genius who works on all this, will kind of pile these up and we'll answer them at the end. Then very important, of course, is this turquoise line in the middle where it says your support is vital. Please donate here. Please think of something that might be the equivalent of admission to come and see something like this. Of course, it's free, but if you feel so inclined and you're enjoying it, by all means, tap that little turquoise line somewhere along the way. So back to Pat. Pat is, he is, as I said, professor of internal medicine, endocrinology, and metabolism at the Wake Forest School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, interested in the relationship between the humanities and the practice of medicine. He has written about, and this is a side issue to tonight's discussion, but he's written about the dehumanizing properties of the electronic medical record. He is an internationally recognized Mark Twain scholar, and along with and has published many commentaries on Mark Twain and a number of medical issues. His main book, and this is really a classic in the field, Mark Twain in medicine, as we'll be finding out, is a big subject. He had all sorts of thoughts about medicine during his lifetime. And back in 2003, Pat came out with Mark Twain and Medicine, Any Mummery Will Cure. We'll be asking him about that in a minute. This book is available in our bookshop. You can go to marktwainhouse.org again, click on the thing that says shop at the top, and you can find a way to contact the store and get one of these. Pat, I just wanted to start off with the title of the book. I looked up mummery.
Yeah, so I originally wanted the title to be Any Mummery Will Cure, and the subtitle Mark Twain in Medicine. But the publishing people thought it would work better the other way with Mark Twain up front, obviously.
Right, yes, he's a great
But the Any Mummery Will Cure, I think, sort of captures a lot of Mark Twain's observations, and he made many observations about the practice of medicine. And this came from Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. And for those who don't know the story, basically a man in 19th century USA, Connecticut, ends up, sort of a time travel thing, finds himself in King Arthur's court. And as he watches what's going on, he's like this brilliant guy because he knows everything about the past, and which nobody knows because he's centuries ahead. But he notices they have this event known as the King's Cure. And this really did happen for a number of centuries in England and in France. And the idea was this: if you had the king's evil, which was scrofula, which is another name for lymph node involvement in your neck with tuberculosis, kind of an incurable thing. People would line up when the king declared this day. You would present yourself before the king. You would lay on the hands, and you would then depart, and your king's evil would be cured by the king's cure, by the king's touch. And so the Connecticut Yankees look at all of this and says, what in the world is this about? And he got an answer from Merlin or from somebody on the court who basically said, any mummery will cure if the patient's faith is strong in it. And in the practice of medicine, those of us who do this thing realize that having the confidence of the patient and the trust of the patient is huge. And for many, many reasons. Now, my guess is that a lot of those people that had scrofula and got better didn't really have tuberculosis. They probably had enlarged lymph nodes for totally benign reasons, and then they got better, but obviously things got attributed to the king's touch. Some years later, when Mark Twain wrote about Christian Science, he wasn't so hot on Christian Science, was somewhat critical, made the observation, again, sort of about what people believe and where people's trust is. And he said, if any commoner had dressed up as the King of England, the cure rate would have been the same as the King of England. And vice versa, if the king had been a commoner, his cure rate would have been dismal. So there's something about the ceremonial things we do in medicine, the laying on the hands, the white coat, and all the stuff that creates comfort and in many ways does help patients get better.
I had to look up mummery, and I guess it means sort of like a pantomime. At Christmas time in England, they have pantomimes, and the people who perform these pantomimes and dress up as horses and things like that are, in fact, they're called mummers. So that's what it's sort of like, whatever. So he's talking about acting, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's something about professional regalia, whether you're talking about in the church, in the medical profession, or a lot of other places, and somehow there's that comfort of knowing, or that confidence of knowing, this person's legitimate because they have the right clothes on and they have the right mannerisms.
Now, I don't want to ask you to summarize your entire book, but I mean, in general, we have a general idea that Mark Twain was skeptical about medicine, and yet he tried some things that today would be considered the most fringiest of medical attempts at cure. Sort of what did his attitude evolve through life? What was it in general? What did he?
Well, it did. I think you have to remember that he came along at a time when death rates were high, especially, I mean, in kids. So if you were born in Hannibal, Missouri, when he was born in Hannibal, Missouri, your chance of living to age 21 was about 50%. So there's a lot of disease, a lot of it was infectious disease. There was a lot of fright and a lot of worry and a lot of concern about things out there that eventually harm us that we can't do very much about. And the standard physician had very, very little in his armamentarium to really turn that around. And so people went out and tried all these different sorts of things, electrotherapy and hydrotherapy and any sort of therapy you want to mention, just in the hope something good would happen. And sometimes it seemed like it did. His mother actually went out and saw a faith healer to help her deal with the toothache, and it apparently got better. So he was kind of always in the search for something that was legitimate scientific medicine, and wasn't quite sure that he ever found it. But as he explored all these things, he made a number of comments, both in his letters, in his speeches, in his books, that really give us a lot of insight into what 19th century medicine was like. And for someone who likes history, it's actually interesting to see how much of that carries forward. If you come to one of my clinics and talk with some of my patients, there's a whole lot of alternative medicine going on. And sometimes you have to take a face and nod your head and say that's interesting. And sometimes you just have to cringe. And so in a lot of ways, it's no different. I think people are still seeking the same sorts of securities that they did back then.
And back then, of course, you say it's that it was almost impossible to avoid these epidemics in the Mississippi Valley, but it was entirely impossible to avoid them. Correct? I mean, with absolutely no.
Yeah, the epidemics, especially in the Mississippi Valley, seem to sort of come up the river, usually in the summer, and so you would have cholera epidemics. So there's a spell one year where I think within 1 week, 6 people in Hannibal died of cholera. And it's called Hannibal's not that big a town, including one of Sam Clemens' friend's father. Another year, there was lots of typhoid fever. People were dying left and right, and his sister once wrote a letter around that time that said, the way things are going now, this whole town is going to be depopulated. We don't know if we're going to have any survivors. This is awful. So this stuff kept on coming and coming. And the other problem is there's really no appreciation of the germ theory of medicine as we know it. That all sort of got going in 1880 and after that. So all that people knew was there's something in the atmosphere, something in the environment that sort of passed through and came through, and if you were unfortunate, it landed right on you.
Now, didn't he, late in life, didn't he ascribe his literary career to?
He certainly did.
Incident?
He certainly did, and I have. There's actually some. Let me read around so I don't do any terrible misquoting here. But yeah, so the turning point of his life. Apparently some important famous authors were asked to write about the turning point of their life, and he actually talked about an epidemic of measles, and I'll kind of read what he wrote. For a time, a child died almost every day. The village was paralyzed with fright, distress, despair. Children that were not smitten with the disease were imprisoned in their homes to save them from the infection. In the homes, there were no cheerful faces. There was no music. There was no singing, but of silent hymns. No voice, but of prayer. No romping was allowed. No noise, no laughter. Their family moved spectrally about on tiptoe in a ghostly hush. I was a prisoner. My soul was steeped in this awful dreariness and in fear. At some time or other, every day and every night, a sudden shiver took me to the marrow. And I said to myself, there, I've got it, and I shall die. And so he ended up deciding he just had to resolve the issue. He just had to resolve it. So he actually went and found a friend who had come down with measles, crawled into bed with the friend, hoping he would catch measles, figuring out one way or the other, this thing's going to be done with. Either I'll get measles and I'll die, I'll get measles and I'll live, but at least it'll be done. And what I find fascinating about this in 2020, as I converse with the number of patients who feel trapped in their homes and something is missing in life and something is lacking, and when is this going to end? You feel the same melancholy, the same heaviness of spirit, and probably even worse so back then, because back then they didn't know about germs. All they knew is something came along in the air, in the environment. Yes, you could catch it from another person. It was contagious, but it was also in the greater atmosphere, and you could just get it any old place. So you got to stay inside, you got to stay trapped in. They didn't know about masks, they didn't know about social distancing, those sorts of things.
And then I guess the was that after he did that, at least according to his version, his mother took him out of school and put him to work as a printer's apprentice.
Yeah, I mean, she basically said, according to his version of the story, I can't control this boy. He needs some discipline. I cannot do it. He needs a job. We're going to put him to work. Now, it's probably a little more complicated than that because his father had died earlier. The family was really having some financial problems. And his father was really the disciplinarian. He was a dour, serious kind of guy that played things by the rule. Jane, his mother, was a little more free-spirited, a little more laughing, a little more accepting. And you kind of get the feeling, she had this house of a couple other kids, actually 3 other kids in addition to Sam Clemens. And here he was off running the risk of making her other kids sick. So I think there's a couple different ways to interpret that, one of which might be financial, one of which is this guy just needs some discipline at age 13, 14 that I can't give him anymore.
Yeah, well, I know he never let the facts get in the way of a good story sometimes.
Yeah, there's actually a couple variations on that, but that's sort of the one that comes through. And sometimes he's off a year or two as he tells a story about how old he was and what else was going on.
Right.
He has been known to embellish things a little bit if he can make a good story an even better story, which is the fun of it all. I know some people that way.
Yeah. So, of course, after that childhood and his career on as a printer and on as a riverboat pilot, he ended up heading out west to be a journalist, to be a miner, and then to be a journalist, and sort of got his start. Took on the pen name of Mark Twain, and really started gaining a lot of fame, and of course then. That ultimately resulted in his being sent on this marvelous trip to Europe and the Mediterranean, which he recounts in The Innocents Abroad, which was his first big major blockbuster bestseller. But the trip through Europe was punctuated by encounters with epidemics. Isn't that right?
That is correct. Again, cholera was a recurrent thing. So as this cruise boat went from one place to another place, Quaker City, a lot of towns, they stopped and said, wait, you people can't come off. We're afraid of you bringing cholera until we quarantine you 10 days, 14 days. And that just really didn't work with the schedule. And it became a bit problematic for him when they got to Athens, because they just told him no one's out of this boat for 11 days. Well, we're not going to be here for 11 days. And he wanted to see the Acropolis and the Parthenon. So he and a few other people sort of broke the rules, got on this little rowboat and made it to shore. And in the middle of the night, gave themselves a tour of the Acropolis, Parthenon, and enjoyed the famous sights of Athens. He was obviously a little bit of a rule breaker in his day.
And as a medical man, you would probably say, don't try this at home.
Yeah, don't try this at home. As a medical man, I would say stay off cruise ships for a while.
Exactly. Yeah, but of course, it's resulted in this incredibly beautiful account of the Parthenon by moonlight, because it
was a fabulous story. Yeah,
they made their way through the quiet streets and avoided some guards, and I think maybe bribed some others, and then found themselves in this incredible, moonlit landscape of the Parthenon and the Acropolis.
Yeah. So obviously in his younger days, certainly as a child, as a young man, as a young writer, he tended to violate some of the rules. It's interesting, though, as he got a little older, became married, had children, then all of a sudden he becomes a little more protective. And certainly by the time he's living in Hartford, he has a lot of care and worry about the well-being of his family. Yeah. And then becomes a real stricter to the rules kind of guy when it comes to medical issues.
Yeah. So I sort of moving on from the journalist days to his, it was really quite soon after that trip that he met Livy Clemens, Livy Langdon, his future wife. And as you say, married, had kids, and then started taking on sort of the more middle class professionals life, and under fairly, at least at the outset, fairly comfortable surroundings. I mean, he was able to build this beautiful house that we still take care of today. But as you say, there were still dangers lurking even in sophisticated and wealthy Hartford.
Yeah, and I think and he had immense worries about that, but some of his worries, I think, actually preceded that just a little bit, because after he was married, they lived for a short while in Buffalo, New York. And that year or two in Buffalo was a terrible year. Uh, a a friend of Livy's came to visit, and she came down with typhoid fever, and she was basically sick as could be. And Sam Clemens and Livy Clemens are spending all of their time nursing her, and this friend actually died in their bed. Livy was pregnant now with their first child, Langdon. Langdon is born. Now, Livy comes down with typhoid fever herself, and by his writing, Sam Clemens is very concerned that she may not survive all of this. And so eventually at some point, and he cannot do anything professionally. He can't write, he can't focus on things. And so he made the comment, I cannot stand another 8 months like the past 8 months that I've been through. It's been the most horrible, horrendous experience of my life. We just got to get out of Buffalo. And I don't know if his thinking, again, whether there's something about the environment, about the air, but certainly the trigger was to come to Hartford. And obviously there were professional reasons also regarding the publishing industry and so forth. Hartford was a very attractive community. But the other part of this I think is important is along the way. Now they're in Hartford, and he takes little Langdon for a little buggy ride, and he gets his mind drifts and wanders a little bit, becomes a little inattentive briefly, as probably fathers sometimes do, and he notices on a cold winter day the blanket is off the child's leg. They get back home, and they fixed all that, got the kid warmed up, but then eventually Langdon dies. He actually develops diphtheria and dies. Now this, remember, is back before we knew about germs. And Sam Clemens was convinced that he was personally responsible for his child's death by exposure to the cold, by exposure to that bad air. And even in contemporary times, the people that were there, family members, have written, he died of diphtheria. The doctor said he died of diphtheria. There's no doubt he died of diphtheria. But even as an older man, when Sam Clemens recalled all of this, he basically said, I was responsible. It was my inattention to my child caused him to die. So this guilt thing was a profound and immensely important guilt thing. And I think that does play through when we look at some of his interactions with his daughters that come along later.
And now Pat has done some rather important research and work of his own that involves the Hartford House. We've always known that in 1881 there was a makeover of the house. They extended the kitchen a bit. The Tiffany firm came in and did a lot of decorating. There was a lot of work going on at the time. It was partly that they finally had the money to do that. And it seemed like a good thing to do, brighten up the place, make it a little more easy to work in. But you have something else that you think was a major factor in that.
Yeah, I did. I sort of came about this in a roundabout way. I found an article in the New York Times from 1886, and it was entitled Dr. Plummer and Mark Twain. And it tells a story about how this unscrupulous doctor and unscrupulous plumber somehow cheated Mark Twain out of $1,500, which is $36,000 in our money, by redoing his plumbing, because they've got him, and specifically got Livy, to fear that all of their children's illnesses were caused by the bad plumbing. And I thought, well, that's kind of a weird story. There must be some way to track all of that down. And lo and behold, the plumber is actually very identifiable. James Ahern, who is one of these people that actually promoted sort of the best quality of plumbing. So I'm going to give you a slightly different background on it, a little more framing. So if bad air causes diseases, which was a thought at the time, malaria is bad air, for example. So malaria, bad air, we know if you're in wet places, boggy places, you're going to get sick from whatever that air is about. People are finding that the well-to-do folks that were putting modern plumbing in their homes seem to have more health problems all of a sudden. And so their plumbers like James Ahern said, well, I'm a plumber, but your plumbing is not as good as it ought to be, because when you think about that standing water in those drains and in those traps and in those pipes, you're basically just bringing little micro swamps into your home. And whatever that bad air is, your people are going to get sick from it. But I know how to fix it. I know how to make it right. And what happened is, I forget my dates right here. So the family moved into the house in September of 1874, and come January, just 4 months later, Susie, the oldest child, is extremely sick. It looks like she probably has diphtheria, which they called membranous croup back in the day. And Clemens wrote this. He said, it kills someone's child every day, and all the mothers are in a state of fright, which no one can realize who hasn't seen it. And he actually did not do any traveling at that time. He promised that he would stay home until, and there's a quote, the epidemical and dreadful membranous croup had quitted the atmosphere around Hartford. So this, whatever this thing was, it was in the air, it was in the atmosphere, and we had to wait till it went. And poor Livy was just distressed. I think when he talked about poor Livy being distressed, he was also distressed, but he couldn't say that because he's a macho kind of guy. So there were these concerns. So these illnesses kept on coming up repetitively. And so eventually, here's Ahern, who's writing in the local newspaper, The Current, about how important it is to have your plumbing in good shape. And then one of Mark Twain's, Sam Clemens' neighbors, graduates from medical school, Edward Beecher Hooker, who is actually the nephew of the folks right next door to the Mark Twain House. And I'll let you fill in some of the names. I actually have some of the names written down, but I lose track of all the Beechers and the Hookers after a while. But in any event, he's a neighborhood guy, goes on to medical school, comes back to the greatest and best of education. Now he's putting articles in the paper about, wow, you got to take care of your plumbing. I mean, he was sort of a forward-looking guy. He was into preventative medicine, which was a novel sort of thing. But the article said things like, if you have bad plumbing in your house and your family is sick, you are absolutely responsible for that, as if you had been putting arsenic in their food every day. So all of these things sort of added together, and lo and behold, here comes 1881, and now all of a sudden, plumbing is being totally redone. You can actually find in the Mark Twain archives in Berkeley the contract with Mark Twain and the plumber. That's $1,500, the same $1,500 that was mentioned in this newspaper account. So everything pretty much fits together. The one thing that's off just a little bit is this. According to this article, Mark Twain was out of town for a couple of months and presumably had no communication with his wife, which has never, ever, ever happened. And she saw the kids getting sick, and she had this panicky thing and called the doctor in, and then the doctor went and found the plumber to come in and fix all of this. And so by the time he came back, according to the story, he was just outraged about how they had been cheated. The story is actually a little bit different because in truth, he was the guy that went and signed the contract with the plumber to fix all of this up. And then a couple of years later, around 1886, he finds that was probably not necessary. It was probably bogus. Although at the time, and I use the term bogus cautiously, because in 1881, it was actually state-of-the-art, high-quality medical preventative care. The White House in Washington, D.C. underwent similar revisions. That was when James Garfield was shot, and he lingered on for a while, and he eventually died, probably because the doctors, not knowing about germs very much, kept poking at his wound and trying to find out where the bullet was. But he died And that death was actually ascribed to this bad plumbing condition in the White House, and then it got swapped out at the same time. And the man who did it got some criticism for not doing it quite as well as it should have been done, who happened to be George Waring, who happened to be a friend and associate of Mark Twain, has an engineering background, sanitation background. So 1886, Mark Twain, Sam Clemens says, I want you to come and inspect my house. I'm still not happy with the plumbing. And I think right there, it was kind of let out, gosh, they sure did a lot of crazy stuff here that just did not need to be done. And that's when he went absolutely irate and was quoted in the paper about all of this. There's actually a couple of things that were said in this article that I really do want to share because they're just lovely and wonderful, and you'll understand why I was so attracted to this subject. It was said that when he came back, Sam Clemens goes out on this trip, arguably comes back home, finds out what's been going on, how he's been cheated. In his wrath, the manner in which he cursed sewer gas, doctor, and plumber was said to have been an education in the comprehensive possibilities of the English language. I almost wish you were there to hear the comprehensive possibilities of the English language as it pertains to this. And then the article ends up by saying how the really fine work of the best plumber in town had been torn out for the poorer work put in to ease the fond fears of a loving mother. Okay, that's Livy, that's probably fair. Carry out the whim of a too scientific doctor. Gotta be careful about too scientific doctors are out there. They're up to date with the modern stuff, and the modern stuff, gotta be careful. And add some $1,500 to the pile of a rapacious plumber. I don't know if the New York Times would put in rapacious plumber these days. I would guess there would be some litigious aspects of that could become problematic. So basically, that's what happened. So it's a fascinating story. I first read it and said, this doesn't make any sense, but it should be something that can be tracked down, and it got tracked down.
Now, but you think that he actually told the story in a way that essentially blamed Livy for this?
Yeah, I mean, the way the article is written is that he was out of town for a couple of months, and poor Livy was so concerned about the health of her children. She did not know what to do. I'm paraphrasing here, and called in the doctor, and the doctor said, well, you obviously have problems with your plumbing, and you need to get it fixed. That's what's going on. And so all of this happened, presumably without him knowing any of it. Then he came back to town. Livy runs to him, arms open, to tell him exactly what's been going on, and then he has this tirade. Now, I mean, the timing doesn't fit. He didn't go more than 24 hours out of town, I think, without writing to her, she writing to him. I mean, they, as you know, they are always keeping up with each other. So it's one of those things. He made a decision, but I think in the retelling of the story, somehow, somewhere, he conveniently managed to make him not the guilty party for signing up the plumber, but is actually kind of Livy's worrisomeness. But that's sort of the basis when you think of the McWilliams stories, where he sort of takes what happens in his family and turns it around a little bit. And usually, for those who don't know about the McWilliams family series, about 3 different stories, he had a 4th one in mind, where sort of a lot of domestic things happen. And it's always an overly worried wife and a calm, smooth, somewhat intrigued husband with witticisms, which, as in many marital arguments and discussions, a husband's perception of witticism and the wife's perception of witticism don't always bind together.
Well, I'd hate to think that he, in fact, pinned this story on his wife. I think, do you think this was a neighborhood story that sort of got changed in the telling?
Yeah, so there was a writer. There's a writer who basically hung around the neighborhood, talked to people. And I think it was sort of a story that was out there, because the original It didn't actually originate in the New York Times. There's sort of a Boston
I remember that.
tabloid, I guess, if you will, that had a lot of gossipy stuff. And the original had this story about Harriet Beecher Stowe, the lady next door who is the aunt of the doctor in question. And this woman talks about, well, I went and took a walk with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she told me this, and she talked about that. And then they kind of segue into some conversation about the different charities in Hartford that are in competition. And then it sort of segued, oh, by the way, here's an interesting story I bet has never been reported before. So she clearly got it from somebody in the neighborhood. At one point, she says she got it from the best possible authority, and in another place says, but I didn't get it directly from Mark Twain. So there's obviously some gossip around the neighborhood about what happened. And in the midst of all of this, what happened is as he started off actually with the plumber just doing some work, and the plumber kept doing more work, and the plumber kept doing more work. And every time the plumber came by, he needed more money to do some more work. And Sam Clemens did not see where this was going to end. And so he just insisted that, hey, we need to have a contract. There has to be a limit to all this. And he made the observation in a letter, if we don't get some control over this, we are going to be the laughing stock of Hartford. So there's obviously some knowledge around and about that, wow, there's a whole lot of stuff going on over there.
Over there in the plumbing.
That's a nice, new, wonderful house. Why are they doing all that reconstruction stuff?
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that's always interested me, their family physician for most of their time in Hartford was a homeopath, correct? And what was that all about? I mean, that's
you have to be careful in that era about how people are labeled. So people that are sort of traditional physicians, if you will, people like me, the people that have MD degrees and DO degrees are considered allopathic. The homeopathic group had a totally different mindset, and the mindset there was that less is more. And so homeopathic medicine was basically to give as little of therapy as you can and let the body restore itself. And so it was actually kind of a medicine of dilutions, and they took some sort of active agent or presumably active, and they diluted it. And the more dilute, paradoxically, the more powerful it was said to be to fix things up. And so a lot of people practiced homeopathic medicine. According to the outcomes of the Civil War, there is evidence that homeopathic medicine was superior to allopathic medicine. Because if you did the comparative thing, you got soldiers that are wounded, they're infected, they've lost a lot of blood. The allopathic doctor would come by with very little to offer, except, well, let's draw some more of your blood away, let's give you some purgatives, let's kind of change your system that way. The homeopathic doctor, by in essence doing nothing, had a better outcome, because sometimes doing nothing is better than doing the wrong thing. So there was some establishment for homeopathic medicine as a relatively safe thing. Now, the reality is most of these doctors in that era were sort of eclectic. So they took a little bit from that branch, they took a little bit from that area, and they kind of created their own approach to medicine. So there's a lot of synergy that was going on. But he was officially homeopathic.
And of course, I mean, speaking of other sort of further out kinds of medicine, Clemens and his family, well, you mentioned his interest, sort of hostile interest in Christian Science, but also they were always looking into ways to cure their various conditions, that including this Kellgren method in Sweden, and there were
his osteopathic thing, which is kind of a manipulation thing, kind of almost like a chiropractic kind of thing, which supposedly was going to help their youngest daughter Jean and her seizure disorder. It didn't, but for a while it looked like it did. And that's always the problem in medicine. If you have illnesses that sort of show up episodically, sporadically, a lot of times if there's some frequency, you'll go see the doctor and the doctor will do anything. And then the thing doesn't happen for a while. Well, whatever the doctor did must work. And sometimes it's just the luck of the variation of the rhythm of the thing.
Yeah. I mean, visitors are often interested in the the various health conditions. Of course, Susie ultimately died of spinal meningitis in the house. Livy had a condition all during her married life, it seems, that weakened her in various ways. That was often referred to as neuralgia. Was that the?
Yeah, neuralgia or neurasthenia, which is sort of popular in that era. The idea was that your body is like a battery and it just gets drained. It just doesn't have enough energy. And presumably the people most susceptible were the people that were intellectual, intelligent, productive, and you just have kind of worn yourself down. So neurasthenia, some people would suggest is still around today in different versions, different formats. Sometimes we call it chronic fatigue syndrome, maybe. Sometimes we call it other sorts of things. There's something about medical illnesses that if you have a name to it, it gives it some legitimacy. People like to know what is the name of what I have, even if there's nothing necessarily to be done about it very much.
Just before we move on to what the audience is interested in, I wondered where did you get this interest in Mark Twain? I don't know. My doctor is mildly interested in Mark Twain, but where did you get this passion?
I was a boy in Conrad, Iowa, population 600. And so not small town, smaller than Hannibal. We actually had some water running by. It was not the Mississippi River. It was Wolf Creek. You could catch fish there. And according to my father, Wolf Creek actually would get you into the Iowa River if you were patient enough and into the Mississippi River. So, but I could never figure out how to build my raft. But be that as it may, on a box of Cheerios, once upon a time, was a little coupon you could clip off, and my mother did send it in with $1 bill, and you could buy for your child a literary classic. And from the list, she chose Huckleberry Finn, which was gifted to me. It was the first book I ever owned, which was a wonderful thing. It was a hardback book. And obviously it was an amazing, fabulous story. And ever since then, I started reading all the Mark Twain stuff I could read through the years. And as I got into my medical profession, and as his personal letters became more available through Berkeley and so forth, and wow, there's just a lot of medical stuff in here. That is just really fascinating to kind of piece together, put together, and organize. And then somewhere along the line, some very kind Mark Twain scholars, that's a little redundant phraseology because they all are, I was asking some questions. Oh, you need to come to one of our meetings in Elmira, give a presentation. I can't do that. I'm a medical doctor. You guys are like smart people though about history and language and stuff. But I went, figuring, if I make a fool of myself, I never go back again. And I've done that plenty of times before. And then there was some enthusiasm for me pursuing this and actually putting it together as a book. But it's been a fun pursuit, and actually it's an ongoing pursuit through the years. I do, if I may, if you would indulge me, there's one thing that actually I do want to read for the audience. And this is sort of emblematic of kind of why I love this stuff. It must have been fabulous to get a personal letter from Mark Twain, because he was as witty and as bright there as he was in his most polished writing. So the story is this. He wakes up in the middle of the night one night with the most horrendous foot pain imaginable. He has gout. First attack of gout. Horrendous pain. Calls in the doctor. Doctor checks him out, gives him some medicine for pain relief, and goes on his merry way. The next day, Mark Twain writes a letter to one of his friends. He says this: I get up on my feet this morning. I'm not kept back by the gout. The gout is of no consequence. The doctor says so himself. Neither is hell to a person who doesn't live there. And this is one of those things that every time I read it, it's good for me to read it, because it reminds me that even though something is commonplace to me as a physician, having it seen many times and no big deal, for the person suffering, it's a whole different thing. So Mark Twain, as the spokesman really for all of us, really did promote empathy in physicians and commented on their caring attitude and their style and their compassion. That personal interaction was really, really, really the important and most critical thing. One other thing that, if I can just butt in real quickly, because I know there's at least a few students in this listening group right now. When his wife was dying of heart failure, the doctors came and they changed this treatment and that treatment and some other treatment and some other dietary change, and nothing was working. And he wrote, "It seems a stupid idea to keep a medical student in school for 4 years to only learn how to guess, and then guess wrong at that. And if I'm ever deathly ill," he said, "just keep the doctors away and let me die naturally." It's always interesting for those of us who've gone to medical school when someone suggests at some point we might have guessed. I might have guessed wrong, and then we feel guilty. But those are some of the fun things that I find in Twain and medicine and his conversations around all of that.
No, thank you so much, Pat. And I'm going to call Jennifer out from her hiding. There you are. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. Oh my goodness, Dr. Ober, I just wish you had some enthusiasm about your subject. It just
I know. Total it's an interview.
I'm a dull guy, but I'm an introvert. It's just a performance thing that gets rejuvenated.
Well, it's been so fascinating. It looks like the audience is loving it. It also.
I paid some of those people.
I'm sorry.
I paid some of those people. Yeah.
Oh, I could tell. It's very.
Some of them will either graduate or not graduate from medical school, depending on their enthusiasm.
well, one way or another. Oh, irregardless apparently is a word now. So
I heard that yesterday or the other day. Yeah.
Heard that too.
These people in the audience, as our audience members always do, have great questions. And I'm going to start with one from Walter L. Powell. And 2 other people asked this question as well. As Pasteur and others provided evidence of microbial infection, how soon was Clemens aware of the science? Do we know?
He became aware of it. So this was really taking place in the 1880s, 1890s. There was a microbiologist in Connecticut that actually wrote a pretty substantial book on this. And it actually triggered Twain to write about 3,000 years among the microbes. So he was onto it pretty quickly. The amazing thing about Mark Twain, he was up to date with everything going on. And so he knew this stuff pretty much as soon as it was out there. So he did catch on eventually, but sometimes it was actually the medical profession that lagged behind a little bit, was a little more skeptical. People like Lister couldn't convince doctors to wash their hands before they went and saw patients.
Wow, that seems impossible.
We didn't believe in that germ stuff.
Wow. That's hard to believe now, but of course it makes sense.
Well, there's some people out there that don't want to wear a mask today. They must not believe in germ stuff either.
Yeah, that's a big topic.
Yeah, I'm going to throw that in to get a little political.
You mentioned placebo effect just a moment ago, and Deborah Chilcott, I think I'm saying her name correctly, says, "I'd love to hear your ideas about the placebo effect. The medicine mummery continues unabated today," she says.
Yeah, so the effect is an amazing one, and sometimes there's several different ways to look at it. One of which is some things are just going to get better anyway, but there is this mind-body connection we don't understand all that well. There's some interesting studies on warts in the dermatology literature, and one of the problems was looking at therapies for warts is some warts just disappear and get better anyway. But in some of Mark Twain's writings dealing with Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, they talked about all these various ways that you could cure warts, and it's seemingly that it would work. They would go out into the woods and find some spunk water, which is an old stump and it's got some water in it. It's been there, and if you put your hands in it, but I think you have to have dead cat with you, and it has to be late at night and maybe a black cat. But you go through all these incantations, and lo and behold, your warts get better. So a certain number of things get better because they're going to get better. Some get better probably because our mood and our emotions have a lot to do with it. There's actually some fascinating literature in the cancer literature and in the old days of the HIV/AIDS literature, where you could take people that seem to have comparable level of disease, ask them what they thought their outcome was going to be. And one group would be optimistic, I'm going to beat this thing, I'm going to do well. Another group pessimistic, this thing's going to do me in. And that was the only difference you could find. And the people with the more positive attitudes actually, truly, literally do better. So whether it's a hormone thing, whether it's a chemistry thing, who knows what it is? But it's out there. So the placebo effect, interesting, even though we tend to denigrate it a little bit, is a real event. And sometimes, and that's I think a lot to do with being a doctor. I talk to people about the doctor who has that therapeutic personality. You just talk to them for a while and you feel comforted and you feel like things are going to be okay and things are under control. It does not change the disease process at all, but the fact that that person seems to know and understand who you are and where you're coming from will make all of the difference in the world.
Well, several of our people in the audience have commented that they wish you were their doctor, that you were.
Sadly, that's why I'll probably, sadly, actually wonderfully, it's why I'll never retire, because I was in clinic yesterday and my patients keep saying, "Are you going to retire? Are you going to retire?" I said, "No, you're like your family, your friends. I got to keep up with your story."
Oh, that's awesome.
It is such an honor. It is such an honor to be a doctor, just so fabulous. It's something we sometimes lose track of when we get into all the commotion of stuff and all the politics and all the craziness. But wow, there's no better job. Being a doctor, being a teacher. I get to be both. Wow. I've been in heaven ever since I've got out of college, I guess.
That's awesome. Well, Preston Postle in our audience is rightly taking credit for having mentioned spunk water early in the chat today.
Excellent.
And so I told you. Yes, you did, Preston. So to reward you, I'm skipping ahead to ask your question, which is that painkiller was a patent medicine that appears in Tom Sawyer. Do you know anything about Twain's interaction with quack medicines over his lifetime?
Oh, it is wonderful connection. He was very intrigued by his mother. Jane was into it. Now, Jane was worried about her kids, and she would try any medical remedy that came along. Everything was open. She's the one that went off and saw the faith healer. So as cholera was coming up the river and everybody was terribly frightened, something called Harry Davis's painkiller was touted as a cure or a preventative. Now, this is interesting stuff because it's mainly alcohol. The only thing that's kind of mixed in with it is capsaicin, which is the stuff that makes hot peppers really hot. And then there's a little camphor in there to give it kind of an aromatic smell. And it was first used on cuts and scrapes and scratches, one of those things like, wow, yeah, that stuff must be doing some good because wow, is it ever hurting? But then someone suggested it was useful as a cholera preventative. And so Jane had Sam Clemens take some. And it was awful. He felt like he was going to burn out his insides. And so he told his mom, "You don't have to actually dose me every day. I'll take care of it myself. I'm a big boy." And so every day he would pour a little bit in the cracks on the floor just so the bottle would decrease its level. And one day, just sort of for fun, the cat came through and he gave the cat a dose, and the cat just went berserk and ran around and knocked all over all the plants, jumped out the window, caused all sorts of havoc. Or so the story goes. And he actually wrote about this in Tom Sawyer, with Tom kind of being that same person that he was. Aunt Polly, who was sort of the equivalent of his mother, said, "What in the world have you done to that cat? That's mean, that's cruel, that's terrible." And he said, "Well, I had to." Tom Sawyer, because I had to do it, because the poor cat doesn't have an aunt. Aunt Polly says, "Well, what does that have to do with anything?" And Tom says, "Well, he needs somebody to burn out his bowels." And the chief apparently felt a little bad about what she had made his poor boy do.
Well, Our good friend Kevin McDonald also wanted to talk about painkiller, and he says it smells like vapor rub and tastes god awful. Is it possible that it actually had any medicinal value?
Who knows? I whenever people ask me about anything, I don't know. Maybe it does. I mean, it has enough alcohol in it. It would kill germs on your skin, I'm pretty sure. Not sure that I would take it internally, although I guess it's just mainly alcohol and capsaicin. And but whatever you do, don't take Clorox for COVID virus.
Thank you, doctor. Oh,
Josh, an extension of the same thing.
Sounds like Kevin McDonald has tried painkiller.
I'll bet he has. Has it made him better? Has it made him a better person? That's what I want to know.
Kevin, let us know if you are listening and able to answer that. We'd like to know, please.
We would.
One of our wonderful historic interpreters, Josh, has asked, is there anything you learned as you conducted research for this book that particularly surprised you?
I'm one of those naive people where everything surprises me. Not really. It just sort of extends my vision and understanding of humanity. One thing that was sort of interesting, and I know Steve knows about this, and you likely do too, is when they fumigated the Hartford house because of all the scarlet fever, and it basically took all the finish off all the doorknobs. And Mark Twain wrote about all this, and it cost him $200-300. And the idea again there was, we don't know what scarlet fever is, except our girls keep getting sick from it. And finally they got well enough to move off to Elmira for the summer. And the same old Dr. Edward Beecher Hooker came by and said, here's the current therapy for it. We take sulfuric acid and we'll just spray it around and we'll just kill those, whatever it is. We don't know about it being a germ yet. And took all the finish off the hardware. And again, this was not wacko therapy. You could find papers in the Lancet, the British Medical Journal. It's very accepted therapy. So it's just bad. This sulfuric acid will take care. I'm just going to take care of scarlet fever.
And the follow-up is that we did find signs of this on the doorknobs in the house when we redid the mahogany room a couple of years ago. So that you could see where the old finish had been worn off by acid. Acid was the wrong thing to spray, right?
Acid is wrong. Yeah, acid is the wrong thing to ingest and the wrong thing to spray over your hardware.
Wow. So Kevin has answered and let us know that he he tried painkiller, only a drop on my tongue, only one time. It stings like a needle.
Yeah. Oh. See, and I think that was the idea. It's one of those things that if it burns this much and hurts this bad, it's got to be doing something good.
Right. Right. Oh, gosh, so many good questions. It's hard to pick from them. I'm going to go with one from George. George says, Mark Twain invested in Plasmon, a milk-based cure. Has it ever been checked from a medical viewpoint, or was it a placebo?
Yeah, Plasmon is basically a nutrient. It's an additive, if you will. I think, as I recall, it's albumin from milk. And so it was going to be this thing that was going to make you strong and powerful and keep you healthy. There's a British Plasmon company and then American, and somehow they were related to each other. And Mark Twain was quite interested in it, invested in it. He thought maybe it would give Livy, who was kind of weak and puny, some energy and some strength. Nobody quite exactly knows the best way to take it, but he would actually apparently just spoon up this dry powdery stuff a couple times a day, and struck me as kind of nasty. So I don't think there's anything particularly wonderful about it. As far as I know, it's just albumin and protein derived from milk. But it was around for a while, and he and Mark Twain certainly advocated its use. Of course, he was invested in it, so he would like people to start buying it.
Well, yeah, right. Well, And one more follow up from Kevin. He says that the painkiller that he tried was from an antique bottle of the stuff, circa 1908. There's a
Wow.
brave man.
That's pretty, yeah, I actually on eBay picked up a couple of antique bottles, and they have this little residue, kind of dark colored and grungy in the bottom. And I've wondered about trying to restore that, but then I was fearful that I might be foolish enough to put a drop on my tongue. So I just have the bottles.
That's pretty neat, though.
But it is neat. Yeah, it is neat. The things that we do as human beings in the name of improving our health and staying healthy, and some of it makes sense and some of it doesn't make sense. And for me, the fun part of it is looking back at history. I wonder 20 years from now and 50 years from now, when people look back at contemporary medicine, what stuff turns out to be just goofy and absurd. And they say, oh, there's a guy, Dr. Ober, and he did this and that, and what was he thinking? Woo!
Well, how about one more? It's hard to pick, but I think I'm going to go with Stephen Roberts, who wants to know, could Mark Twain have been motivated to wear white because medical professionals wore white?
Oh, that's a good question. My impression is he wore white just so he could stand out in a crowd. And I'm trying to think, do I know when the medical profession sort of took on the white coat sort of approach? And I don't know that I know that exactly. So,
right.
I think it was mainly just call attention to himself and be a little bit of a standout, because that's the kind of guy that he liked to be sometimes.
Yeah, and I think the point was he first put it on in February when every man in America wore dark suits and, derbies.
Yeah, so I think it was more of a fashion statement, or an anti-fashion statement, if you will, or a fashion anti-statement, however.
So, fashion anti-statement. Well, I will ask one more since we have just one more second. Alan wants to know, what is the modern term for the nervous prostration Clara sometimes suffered from? Do we know that?
I'm not sure that some of those things are directly translatable. People have lots of symptoms. All of us have symptoms. Sometimes they fit into syndromes. Sometimes they're just sort of freestanding things. So I don't know that I can correlate necessarily any of Clara's situation with contemporary terminology.
Fair enough.
I know if you're talking about the period after her mother died, it could have just been an overwhelming depression, I'm thinking.
I think that's probably true. Yeah. Just pure stress, anxiety, depression.
Yeah.
Overwhelmed by the world, as we're all susceptible to be.
Anyway, that's my diagnosis, but you don't want me to be your doctor.
Okay, I'm going to go with that, Dr. Courtney. Yours is as good as mine. I'll be your consultant, and I will agree with that.
Well, thank you very much.
And our chief curator, Jody, reports that the early 19th century, I believe, is when white coats came into vogue. Into vogue. I don't think she's saying for the. Are you saying for the medical profession or for people in general, Jody? Let us know.
This is a woman with a telephone.
Yeah. So you got a telephone, you can find out anything these days.
That's right. That's right.
I just want
to point out that I did put a link to our museum store, our online museum store, in the chat, so that if you want to purchase a copy of Dr. Ober's book, we follow that link and we'll take care of you. Yes, thank you, Steve Courtney.
It's really, it really is a classic. He didn't come on here to flog his book, which has been out for 17 years. But it's a good one.
I should tell you, Steve, a couple of years ago, the University of Missouri Press sent me a little note that said, you have $17 this year from royalties. We're not going to give you anything unless it's 25 or more. So next year we'll lump them together. To which my wife said, it's probably not time for you to quit your day job just yet. It was written for the fun and joy of writing it, and I'm actually always excited and thrilled when I see someone has it, because as I wrote it, it felt like I was having a conversation with friends and people that I knew And it's actually kind of a fun thing to do. And I was just amazed because I'm one of those people. If you told me as a young person I was going to write a book one day, no, you got to be smart and knowledgeable and witty, and you have to know like good vocabulary and make sentences work. And, but Mark Twain actually, so it's all centered around Mark Twain, of course, which can make a whole lot of things work real well.
Interesting.
And I'll plug you guys in Hartford. If anybody's not been to see that house, go when you get a chance. If you've been 7 times, go 8 times. It is great every single time. Wonderful people, wonderful property. It's fabulous. It's just really, really good stuff. Go there.
Well, we hope we'll see you here again in person one day soon, and that will be a glorious day, won't it?
That will be a glorious day for all of us.
Right. Before we say goodbye, I'm going to give a brief commercial for our next Trouble at Home, which is in the 1880s, a wonderful guest came to the Clemens home, Grace King, who was a writer from New Orleans who had just started earning fame in the literary magazines of the East. And she came up to Hartford, wrote incredible descriptions of her visits to the Clemenses and to other people, and marvelously sort of bitchy comments about New England and the people she met. And these have all, we've known about some of these letters, but very recently, Mickey Pfeffer, a scholar from Louisiana, has put together a book, a collection of these letters. She's been just transcribing these things, I think, since Pat's book came out. She's been working on transcribing these letters since 2004. And she will be with us, and we'll be talking about Grace King and her personality. She became a very close friend of Livy and the girls and the daughters. She was also wrote, I think, one of the best descriptions of what it was like to sort of meet Mark Twain and talk to him. But there's a lot more to the story. And Pat has actually also read this book, and it's a page turner, believe me. But I'm also going to hand it over to you, Jennifer, just to advertise something you are doing starting tomorrow evening.
Oh, thank you for that, Steve. Yes. Every year, the Mark Twain House Museum holds a big writers' weekend, and it was scheduled to be in person this weekend. And we watched as all the other big writing conferences got kicked down to fall or winter or beyond. And we decided, you know what, we're going to do ours online. And so starting tomorrow night, we have Sophronia Scott, who lives right here in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, is going to be giving the keynote address, and then we're going to have a cocktail hour. And then Saturday, we're starting at 9 and not finishing until later so at night with a full program of the most incredible lineup of writers and speakers and people you know, people you don't know yet who you're going to love. Scott Dickers, founding editor of The Onion, is going to be giving a keynote. Mike Reese, a longtime senior writer for The Simpsons. We have Soraya and Nadia McDonald, who was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism this year, giving a Sunday morning keynote. Playwrights panel. It's just amazing. And that these people have pulled together and cooperated with pulling together a virtual writing conference, which is just kind of an amazing feat. I've got to tell you, it's going to be so much fun. It's only $75, which is half the price we normally charge for doing it live. And we've got a lot of people signed up. We'd love to have even more. And the great thing about Crowdcast is it's infinite. The more the merrier. I will add, too, we have somebody from New Zealand registered. We have somebody from Ireland, people from Las Vegas and Seattle and all over the place. So I hope maybe you'll think about joining us. You can find information on the homepage of our website, which, as Steve reminds us, is marktwainhouse.org. I hope to see you there. And thank you for that opportunity, Steve.
Oh, well, thank you for seeming so relatively composed on the eve of this event. You're doing a marvelous job. And Pat, thank you so much. It's always nice to see you. It's just been wonderful to talk to you. I really, I hope
Thank you for the invitation. You know, with you guys, I actually feel like I'm in Hartford at the Mark Twain House, and there's just no better place to be and no better people to be with. So thank you.
Well, that's awfully nice of you. And
mutual. So
absolutely. I feel like I'm in North Carolina.
Okay. It's a good place too.
All right. All right.
Well, Steve and Dr. Ober, thank you so much for a wonderful evening. And as everybody knows, this has been recorded. So immediately when we end, it'll be available to watch over and over as many times as you like. So if there's anything you missed or want to,
that's scary.
No, it's wonderful. So having said all that, good night, everybody, and thank you, and stay well.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.